What's up, everybody? Tim Anderson here, aka Renville, the bearded dwarven princess. I'm joined by Leia and Smeagol, who are passed out on the chair neck. They're actually in my chair, and I had to get Christina's chair from over there. And there's stuff over the bed because we're doing remodeling and painting and stuff, so it's a little chaotic right now. If you're a returning visitor, you know that my rant videos are typically less ranty and more about discussions. And today we're going to be diving into a topic that is going to be a trigger component for some people. Some people are going to, hear us wanting to talk about Amazon's inclusion policy and they're just going to be like triggered. I've seen a lot of people coming on my videos over the last 6 months and making reference to this and claiming that this is the reason that Rings of Power was ruined or that Wheel of Time was ruined, and that this is some sort of mandatory policy that Amazon has, and that it's also a policy at Disney Plus and Marvel and Fox. I don't know, all these other, I don't know. I've heard some really crazy stuff coming from the comments section. We're actually going to be diving into this today. I found this to be a fascinating read. And we're going to be looking at this and whether or not it actually is a mandate or if it's just a set of guidelines. Because some people claim that it's mandatory, and I haven't found that to actually be the case. So we're going to be diving into that today. Before we get going, again, if you're new here, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon if you like this video, and support in any way you can. I'm here live on all of these premieres just as if it was a live stream. So you'll see me down in the comments. You can chat, you can ask questions, and I will answer them in real time. And you can support with super chats and stickers that way. You can also do super thanks down below on this video after it's been uploaded. And of course, if you really like what you see, join as a member of the Adventurers Guild, because we have 3 different tiers of membership. We do lots of cool stuff beyond the live streams and video games that we play. Lots of private videos for our fans. So check all that stuff out. One word of warning, I've only had to do this one time on another video throughout the entirety of my YouTube career, and I'm going to make this disclaimer now up front. Any bigoted or racist comments that I see down below after this video I will be nuking those immediately. We are not here to bash on other people. We are here to discuss the inclusion policy. We're not here to make crazy statements or political statements. There's no agenda here. It's just a discussion about things. So if you can have an adult conversation and have an adult, um, you know, sit down with other people, welcome aboard. If you're going to be a little baby and you're going to be a little child, you're going to make little ranty, racist or bigoted comments, I'm going to delete those and you can show yourself out. So let's move ahead with this. So the number one thing here is that people have made claims that this is a mandatory policy that all shows have to adhere to, and that's what ruined Rings of Power, and Wheel of Time as well. Mostly Rings of Power is what we're discussing today. They say that Galadriel was, a proof of this. I had somebody make a comment the other day that Rings of Power was ruined because of the LGBTQ plus guidelines and forced inclusivity, and I kind of went, what? Because there's no LGBTQ plus characters in the Rings of Power, at least not in the version of the show that I watched. More importantly, though, if you go over and look at the list of Amazon Prime original shows, there are dozens of shows here. There might even be hundreds. I haven't counted. There's a huge list going down. I can talk about some of the ones that I have seen, and I can tell you that the inclusion policy that some people claim is a mandate is not mandatory at all. And you can read the wording of it, and it'll tell you that it's not a mandatory policy. But here's some of the proof of the pudding in my mind. Shows like Bosch. You've got shows like The Man in the High Castle, which was filmed before all of the woke agenda stuff started coming into the conversation. Jack Ryan, a political thriller with a white male lead. Bosch, by the way, my white male lead. We've got Carnival Row. Carnival Row is actually one of those amazing shows that has, I think, a very diverse cast of different characters that is very inclusive in its nature without being forced, including a white male lead. We have Reacher, white male lead. Outer Range, white male lead. So on and so forth. We can get into the comedies now and going from there. But the point I'd like to make is there are plenty of shows in Amazon's rotation, original shows that are produced by them that do not fall into this, you know, strong female character who all the male characters are bowing to, and no one can do anything unless there's a powerful female to guide them. And that's just not true. Amazon produces a lot of television. The Boys, Expanse, above and beyond the ones I just mentioned. There are so many shows that Amazon produces which do not have any sort of forced agenda in them, as some people would claim. But let's go look at the wording of this inclusion policy a little more closely. Um, so, in terms of the most important part is here in casting. Let's say the story come first. The inclusion policy recommends casting characters from all backgrounds as long as it does not compromise the authenticity of the narrative. So recommends, that word right there, recommends, that's not mandatory. It's recommended. It doesn't mean it has to be, and it literally says that as long as it doesn't compromise the authenticity of the narrative. It says, for example, when a movie or series focuses on a particular racial or ethnic group or is set in a homogeneous context or location, it is exempted from the requirements to diversify casting. Now here we see that there are some requirements to diversify casting, but that doesn't mean that they are forcing you. It is recommended. Now, what does this mean? It just means that, as they say here, unless it's something where it is set in a specific racial or ethnic area, then it doesn't have to necessarily follow those guidelines. A good example of this would be uh, Jack Ryan. Great show, white male lead, set in different parts of the world, and it features a multi-ethnic cast, but it is always going to be a white male lead show. Okay, we're not putting a black female or a whatever into that role. It's a white male lead, and it's not being forced to do any sort of adherence to guidelines because their storyline has shown that it doesn't need to be that way. Now, this is the one that a lot of people like to point out from Rings of Power, and they go, well, elves were never black, and dwarves were never black, and you're right. In the books, Tolkien was writing from the standpoint of creating a mythology for the British people. Now, some people would argue that the reason, and this is an interesting one. If you've been here long enough, you've heard me talk about this. I don't care about the skin color of the actors. People have used the argument of, well, you can't have a white actor in the role of Black Panther, so why would you allow there to be a black elf in the role of a white? It should be a white elf. Where does Tolkien ever state that it's white, only white elves? He does mention the color of their skin many times, but he doesn't say that it's mandatory. And I'm just playing devil's advocate here for some people. Because here's the real reality, as far as I understand things, is that Tolkien was writing his books at a certain point of time when Britain was mostly white. It was mostly a colonial atmosphere. And most people who were living in Britain at the time were white people. Does that mean that Tolkien was a racist? I don't think so. It was a product of his times. Does that mean that Tolkien didn't want there to be black elves and black dwarves? I can't speak to that, but he never wrote a guideline that said all dwarves must be white, all elves must be white. He simply was writing something that was, for him at the time that he was alive, an important mythology for his people. Does that mean they have to be all white? I don't know. It doesn't say in the text anywhere that it has to be, those characters have to be white. And that's the crux of many people's problems because they're putting their own interpretation into Tolkien's works. It's a lot different. And yes, I have used the Black Panther example in some of my rant videos, but there is a big difference between a character like Black Panther, who is specifically and explicitly written to be a black African tribe leader and superhero, right? Very specifically written to be that way. And an elf who is in a mythology that was written for the British people at a time when Britain was still very much white based. The Britain of today is very multicultural. Had Tolkien been alive today, would he have written it differently? I have no idea. There's a chance he would have, and that's the modern interpretation that the showrunners have chosen to run with for the Wheel of Time. Not Wheel of Time, sorry, Rings of Power. Also Wheel of Time to some degree, but mostly Rings of Power. Because I know there were comments made by the showrunners and the executive producers that we have to, we're modernizing Tolkien to, we don't know, but he never explicitly stated, whereas Black Panther is explicitly stated. And so there is room for translation there. Again, I'm, showing the benefit of the doubt here. It also says that it is committed to authentic portrayals. It is our intention, whenever possible, to cast actors in a role whose identity aligns with the identity of the character they will be playing by gender, gender identity, nationality, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and/or disability, and in particular when the character is a member of an underrepresented group or identity. Again, looking at Rings of Power, we're dealing with fantastical races. It's never explicitly, and again, explicitly stated is the key here. If something is not explicitly stated, there is room for interpretation, whether we like that or not. My own wife, who is Mexican, I'm married to a Mexican. I spend like half my time in Mexico. Our homestead is in Mexico, and this when we were watching it the first time, Chris has never read the books. She's only ever seen Peter Jackson's films, and she even went, how are there black dwarves and elves? I've never seen black dwarves and elves before. And I went, well, that's a very interesting subject, honey. That's a very complex subject that many people are taking offense to right now because Peter Jackson's films very much ran with the traditional, sort of white European mythology that Tolkien had based it all upon. And if you go back to the roots of what Tolkien had based it on, it was based on Norwegian storytelling and tales, and that not Norway, sorry, not Norwegian, Scandinavian. I don't know why I said Norwegian, but Scandinavian, the Norse, the Vikings, so on and so forth. Um, and that was very much white, not because they were racist, but just because that's who their people were. It's kind of like the Northman movie, the Northman movie. That's not a racist movie. It's not a white power movie. That's just a movie about Vikings, and the Vikings were white. It's like there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So again, diving into this a little bit more, it says to reduce invisibility in entertainment, where the story allows, we aim to include one character from each of the following categories for speaking roles of any size. And at minimum, 50% of the total of these should be women: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or gender nonconforming, non-binary, person with a disability, and 3 regionally underrepresented racial, ethnic, cultural groups, i.e.g. in the U.S., 3 of the following: Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Middle Eastern, North African, or Asia Pacific, or multiracial. A single character can fulfill one or more of these identities. Does this also go into... This leads into the next part, is that most productions have a multitude of speaking roles from lead to smaller roles, and where it doesn't compromise, this is very important, where it doesn't compromise the authenticity of the story, the minimum aspirational goals for speaking roles are 30% white men, 30% white women, non-binaries, and 20% men from underrepresented, 20% men, women and non-binary people from underrepresented races and ethnicities. Where we can have more people, we will seek to do that. Now, let's analyze some of this language really quick. Where it doesn't compromise the authenticity of the story, meaning it's not mandatory, it's not. It is a guideline that they would like people to follow where it doesn't compromise the authenticity of the story. Jack Ryan, Reacher, white male leads. They are not being forced to have a gay or black or whatever person in those roles because it would compromise the story. Those stories, it would be like making James Bond a transgender. It's never going to happen because that would compromise who James Bond is. We can have female characters of equal badassery. Atomic Blonde, by the way, that movie is freaking amazing. I've seen it several times. Charlize is an angel. sexy angel and that movie kicks ass, and you can have those types of characters in different movies, but James Bond always needs to be a male. More than likely a white male if you've listened to the Broccoli family talk about it, because that's what he was written as. And it would compromise the story for him to be anything other than that. It also says here the minimum aspirational goals. Aspirational. That does not mean mandatory. It means we're aspiring to have these numbers, but it's not mandatory. It's something we're aspiring to attain. Pay equity. There's no reason to even discuss that. Everyone should be getting paid across the board. Same, depending on their role. If you're a lead, leads should be getting the paid. If you're a secondary, secondaries get paid the same. Guest roles getting paid the same. I agree with the pay thing 100%. All audition sets and casting calls should strongly encourage people from underrepresented communities to apply. That's awesome. Now, behind the camera, they have a very similar. None of this is mandatory wording. It is should ideally include. That's not mandatory. Um, for a series across we will aim to have. We will aim for. We are aspiring to. We are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are aspirational goals that we are aiming to reach. Dun, 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 dun. Pay equity, yeah. Below the line roles aims to staff department heads in seconds in the following areas to meet overall aspirational goals. Again, none of this is forced. This is the issue I have. People making claims that this is somehow forced when you can clearly go over here and see this list of amazing content that Amazon produces, and you have dozens of productions, if not hundreds of productions, which prove that there is no forced diversity happening here at all. Now, going back to the Rings of Power, was it forced? If it was, if there was a forced diversity issue at play, I don't think it's on Amazon. This is a personal opinion. I think it's on the showrunners for interpreting the story in a way that they chose to make it. So they chose to look at it and say, wouldn't it be cool if we took Galadriel's character and made her this really strong female, this really strong woman? Now, the rest of it, I've heard people claim that all of the men in the show are bumbling idiots compared to Galadriel. Are they, though? Halbrand wasn't a bumbling idiot. Adar wasn't a bumbling idiot. Elendil is not a bumbling idiot. And people are like, well, they played second fiddle to Galadriel and they were following her orders. Were they? Elendil to some degree, but he was following the orders of his queen. Well, she wasn't, that's the. There were plenty of strong male characters in the Rings of Power. A lot of people like to point to the scene in this episode 1 when Galadriel, her men are getting their asses kicked against the snow troll or the ice troll, and then she single-handedly defeats it. Was that forced wokeism? I think you're really reaching if you think that's the case. I looked at that, watched it with my wife, and we both literally looked at each other and went, we went Fast and the Furious. Anytime we see something that's just ridiculously over the top, we literally immediately liken it to and reference back to the Fast and Furious franchise, because there's always these, like a car jumping out of an airplane and then launching a harpoon from the front of it and hooking onto a bridge and then like doing a grappling hook maneuver and landing on the cliff's edge, and you know what I mean? Like it's that kind of stuff where it's just so over the top ridiculous that it's like Legolas jumping up onto the Oliphant, shooting down into its head and then sliding down the trunk and jumping off, and Gimli standing there going, that still only counts as one. Like it's that level of ridiculousness. If you want to try to apply wokeism to that, that's definitely an interpretation of her single-handedly taking out the snow troll, but it's also equally just an interpretation of the leader of that group, who happens to be a female, also being the leader of the group because she's the most battle hardened, most badass, warrior. Um, was that Galadriel's character in the books? Absolutely not. But I don't think for a minute that every little thing that you see on screen with Rings of Power or Wheel of Time was a forced woke agenda, because as we have seen, this diversity playlist and this diversity playbook are by no means mandatory enforced rules. They are guidelines that people are asked to aspire to and to aim to achieve. And as we can see with all of these other productions, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case if the storyline doesn't need it to be. But in the case of shows like, where's the one in here I talked about? It's the one with the L. It's all the crazy. It's a fantasy show with um, Legolas's actor, and now I'm blanking on what it's called. I know it's in here. Carnival Row. Carnival Row, if you have not watched Carnival Row is an amazing show with Orlando Bloom and Carla Delevingne, which has a diverse cast of straight, gay, transgender, so on and so forth, of multiple identities, because they're playing fauns and fairies and elves and humans. This is an amazing show, by the way, if you haven't watched this. And this is a show that I think brilliantly takes advantage of the diversity playlist, because it's including a vast array of actors in a show that's allowing for this wide range of diversity without it being forced. And this goes back to, if you go back to the playbook, the actual policy where it goes up to, it's not behind the camera, it's the stories and characters. Um, Casting from all backgrounds, as long as it doesn't compromise the authenticity of the narrative. And this is where so many people from Rings of Power are getting caught up on, because they have this interpretation of J.R.R. Tolkien's work as white only because it was British and it had to be white. That's an interpretation. It's not like Black Panther, where Black Panther is explicitly written to be black. That's my take on things. I realize that by the end of this, I've probably pissed off a lot of my followers because I know a lot of people have been following my rant videos and having assumptions about some of the things that I was talking about. But I want to make this very clear that at no point in time do I actually think, like many people do, that there's some sort of forced woke agenda happening. I think that there are showrunners who actively try to have a more modern version of a show, for better or for worse. And I think that if you do it right, such as with Carnival Row, you can have a show that has that modern diversity without it feeling forced or fake. On the flip side of that, you can have adaptations like Wheel of Time and Rings of Power, which do attempt, from a showrunner's perspective, to modernize the work, and as a result, it ruins the source material, because that source material was never written to be modernized in that way. That's just my take on things. If you got to the end and you like all of that, hopefully you'll like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, follow along for more as we continue the rant series and beyond. And of course, don't forget, if you want to support the channel, which I hope you do, as we're here in Super Chats, doing a chat and everything, do your Super Chat, Super Thanks after the fact, and of course, memberships down below. And hopefully we'll see you in a live stream. I'm going to be doing some more Rings of Power live streams in the month of November. And also all the video game live streams we do. So thanks for listening, everybody. Hopefully we can have an adult conversation about all this stuff without people having knee-jerk reactions. And let's just discuss not just Rings of Power and Wheel of Time, but let's discuss all of the shows that Amazon produces, because they produce a lot, and not necessarily all of them are these, I mean, just Jack Ryan, Reacher, Bosch, and beyond.